Picture this. It's 1971. You're sitting at a red light in your freshly built Chevelle. The guy next to you revs his engine. You hear that distinctive sound, the sharp crack of acceleration pumps dumping fuel, the whistle of air rushing through ventures, the mechanical symphony of perfectly tuned carburation. In that moment, everything comes down to one thing. Not the engine, not the transmission, not the rear end, the carburetor. The Holley Double Pumper, the Edelbrock Performer, the Rochester Quadrajet, the Carter AFB. These weren't just hunks of aluminum sitting on top of an intake manifold. They were the gatekeepers of power. The difference between your engine making beautiful music or coughing like it had pneumonia. Between blowing the doors off the competition or watching them disappear in your mirrors while you're still trying to clear your throat. Today we're breaking down the carburetors that fed the muscle car era, why grown men still argue about them 50 years later, and the one fueling system that ended the war entirely. Trust me, you're not going to like the ending, but stick around anyway, because this story gets crazy. Part 1. Holley Double Pumper, the street brawler. Let's start with the carburetor that became the face of American performance. When someone says performance carburetor, they're probably picturing a Holley, shiny aluminum body, mechanical secondaries, and those distinctive yellow float bowls that became as iconic as chrome bumpers and racing stripes. But here's what most people don't know. Holley didn't set out to dominate the performance world. They were building carburetors for industrial applications, forklifts, generators, equipment that needed to run reliably all day, every day. Then hot rodders discovered something incredible about the Holley design. Unlike every other carburetor on the market, the secondaries opened mechanically. No vacuum delays. No waiting for engine load to build up. You stomped the gas, and all 4 barrels opened immediately. This was revolutionary. Every other manufacturer was using vacuum-operated secondaries because they were smoother and more refined. But Holley said, forget smooth. Let's go fast. The double pumper took this philosophy and turned it into an art form. 2 accelerator pumps instead of 1. When you hit the throttle, it didn't just open the secondaries. It literally shot raw fuel into the engine like it was angry about something. Street racers figured this out first. While other guys were dealing with hesitation and bog when they tried to launch, Holley guys were already 3 car lengths ahead. Here's a fact that'll blow your mind. By the early 70s, Holley was selling more carburetors to hot rodders than to industrial customers. They had accidentally become the performance king. But it came with a price. Tune a Holley wrong, and it would flood your engine, foul your plugs, and make your car smell like a gas station. These things were temperamental. They demanded respect. Ask anyone who was running Friday night grudge matches in the 70s. Holley was the sound of winning. Sharp, aggressive, immediate. But it was also the smell of raw gasoline if you didn't know what you were doing. The aftermarket went absolutely crazy for these. Companies started making jets, metering blocks, power valves, everything you needed to tune a Holley for any application. By the 80s, you could build a Holley carburetor that was stronger than anything the factory ever made. But here's the thing about being the toughest guy in the room. Everyone wants to fight you. And Holley was about to discover they had some serious competition. Don't go anywhere, though, because that ending we mentioned, the one that changes everything, it's coming. And it's going to completely flip this entire conversation. Part 2. Edelbrock Performer and Carter AFB. The Everyman Hero. While Holley was building street fighters, another company had a completely different philosophy. What if we made a carburetor that actually worked the way normal people needed it to work? Meet the Carter AFB. And later, its more famous cousin, the Edelbrock Performer. Carter Carburetor Company had been around since the 1920s. They weren't trying to win drag races. They were trying to build carburetors that would start every morning, run smoothly in traffic, and not leave you stranded on the side of the road. The AFB, which stood for aluminum 4-barrel, was their masterpiece. 4-barrel carburetor with vacuum-operated secondaries that opened smoothly and progressively. No shocking the engine. No flooding, no drama. Chrysler figured this out first. When they needed a carburetor for their 343 small blocks and 361 big blocks, they didn't call Holley. They called Carter. General Motors was paying attention too. They started using Carter AFBs on their high-performance engines. The Z28 Camaro's 302 small block, Carter. The 425 horsepower big block in a 1965 Corvette. But Carter had a problem. They were great at building carburetors, but terrible at marketing to enthusiasts. While Holley was sponsoring drag racers and getting magazine coverage, Carter was quietly supplying Detroit with reliable, well-engineered carburetors that nobody talked about. Enter Vic Edelbrock Sr. He saw what Carter was doing and realized something brilliant. The AFB design was actually better than most people knew. It just needed someone who understood the performance market. In 1964, Edelbrock started buying Carter AFBs, modifying them, and selling them as the Edelbrock Performer. Same basic design, but tuned specifically for performance applications. The results were incredible. You got the reliability and smooth operation of the Carter, but with the performance credibility of the Edelbrock name. Street guys loved these because they were forgiving. You could tune one wrong and it would still run. It might not run perfectly, but it wouldn't leave you walking home either. Daily driver guys loved them even more. The Performer would start cold, idle smoothly in traffic, get decent fuel economy, and still make power when you needed it. Here's a story that sums up the difference perfectly. There was a local street racer. Let's call him Dave, who had a Nova with a built small block. He tried Holley's, Rochester carbs, everything. Nothing worked consistently until he bolted on an Edelbrock Performer. Dave's car wasn't the fastest in town, but it was the most reliable. While other guys were constantly adjusting carburetors and dealing with flooding, Dave was just driving his car and enjoying it. The aftermarket caught on eventually. By the 80s, Edelbrock was offering complete fuel system packages, carburetor, intake manifold, even fuel pumps. Everything designed to work together perfectly. But remember that game-changing ending we keep talking about? The technology that made all these carburetor wars irrelevant? Keep watching, because it's going to completely destroy everything you think you know about fuel delivery. Part 3, Rochester Quadrajet. The controversial genius. Now we need to talk about the carburetor that everyone loved to hate until it embarrassed them at the drag strip. The Rochester Quadrajet. Or as its critics called it, the Quadrajunk. General Motors had a problem in the late 60s. They needed a carburetor that could deliver fuel economy for daily driving, but still make serious power under full throttle. Every other manufacturer was making compromises. GM said, "What if we don't compromise at all?" Their answer was engineering genius disguised as weirdness. The Quadrajet used a spread bore design with tiny primary ventures for economy and absolutely massive secondaries for power. We're talking about primary barrels so small they looked like they belonged on a lawnmower, but those secondaries, they were enormous. A properly set up Quadrajet could flow over 800 cubic feet per minute. That put it in serious Holley territory. But here's where it gets interesting. Those huge secondaries were controlled by a complex system of vacuum diaphragms, springs, and metering rods that made the carburetor essentially tune itself based on engine load and throttle position. Most people couldn't figure out how to make them work properly. The tuning was complex. The fuel metering was different from anything else. And if you didn't understand the system, they ran terribly. So the aftermarket wrote them off. Hot rod magazines trash-talked them. Performance shops wouldn't touch them. Everyone just assumed they were junk and moved on to Holleys or Edelbrocks. But there was a group of builders who took the time to really understand the Quadrajet. And they discovered something that shocked the performance world. A properly tuned Quadrajet could embarrass almost anything else on the market. The combination of small primaries and massive secondaries gave you the best of both worlds. Great street manners and serious top-end power. Drag racers started paying attention when a few guys showed up at local tracks with bone-stock Quadrajets and started running times that should have required serious carburetor modifications. Here's the crazy part. GM was putting these things on everything. Camaros, Chevelles, Corvettes, even trucks. Most people were ripping them off and throwing them away. The smart money was buying them from junkyards for $20 and embarrassing guys who had spent hundreds on aftermarket carbs. The aftermarket eventually figured this out. Companies started offering Quadrajet rebuild kits, performance modifications, even racing versions. But by then, the damage was done. Most people still thought they were junk. Even today, you can find perfectly good Quadrajets in swap meets for a fraction of what other carburetors cost. Not because they don't work, because people still don't understand them. But that revolutionary fuel delivery system we keep hinting at, the one that made all these tribal loyalties irrelevant, it's almost time. And trust me, none of the carburetor guys saw it coming. Part 4. Carter AFB, the overlooked original. Let's go back to where it all started. Before Holley dominated the aftermarket, before Edelbrock became a household name, before Rochester complicated everything with vacuum controls and metering rods, there was Carter. Carter Carburetor Company didn't just make the AFB that Edelbrock later made famous. They were pioneers in 4-barrel carburetor design going back to the 1940s. When Chrysler was developing their early Hemi engines, they didn't call the flashy companies. They called Carter. When GM needed carburetors for their first fuel-injected Corvettes, before they even had fuel injection figured out, they worked with Carter to develop the backup carburetor system. The AFB design was actually ahead of its time. Aluminum construction when everyone else was using cast iron. Removable metering blocks when other manufacturers were casting everything as one piece. Even the float design was more sophisticated than anything else available. Here's something most people don't know. The AFB was originally designed as a racing carburetor. Carter built them for Indianapolis 500 cars in the 1950s. The street versions came later, but Carter made a crucial mistake. They were engineers, not marketers. While companies like Holley were getting magazine coverage and sponsoring racers, Carter was quietly supplying Detroit with excellent carburetors that nobody knew about. Competition series Carters were absolute weapons. These things could flow serious air while maintaining perfect metering. But you had to know they existed to buy them. And most people didn't. Here's a story that shows how good these carburetors really were. In the early 70s, there was a pro stock racer named Bill Jenkins, Grumpy Jenkins, who was dominating with a Vega that shouldn't have been competitive. Everyone assumed he had some secret Holley setup. Turns out he was running a highly modified Carter Competition Series carburetor that his engine builder had figured out how to tune perfectly. Jenkins won multiple championships with Carter carburetors, while everyone else was fighting over Holleys. But because Carter didn't have the marketing presence, most people never knew. The aftermarket largely ignored Carter until Edelbrock proved the design worked. By then, Carter was focusing on OEM contracts and left the performance market to others. But hardcore purists knew. There's still a group of builders who swear that a properly set up Carter AFB or Competition Series carburetor will outperform anything else on the market. They're probably right. Nobody just talks about them anymore. And speaking of things nobody talks about anymore, that fuel delivery revolution we've been teasing, The technology that ended the carburetor wars permanently, here it comes. And it's going to change everything you think you know about feeding an engine. Part 5. The curveball, EFI, kills the carb. 1987. While Holley, Edelbrock, Rochester, and Carter were fighting over who made the best carburetor, General Motors did something that should have terrified every carburetor manufacturer on the planet. They gave the Corvette electronic fuel injection. Not just fuel injection. Electronic fuel injection with computer control, oxygen sensors, and adaptive learning. A system that could tune itself in real time based on engine conditions, altitude, temperature, and throttle position. Every carburetor manufacturer looked at this and said, "That's interesting, but it'll never work in the real world." Fuel injection was complicated. It was expensive. It required computers. And worst of all, it took the tuning out of the hands of mechanics who understood carburetors. But Corvette owners started noticing something incredible. Their cars started every time, in any weather, at any altitude. The engine always ran perfectly, whether it was cold, hot, or anywhere in between. And the power? Once the system learned the engine's characteristics, it could deliver exactly the right amount of fuel at exactly the right time under any conditions. No flooding, no hesitation, no fouled plugs. The performance world paid attention when modified Corvettes with fuel injection started embarrassing carbureted cars at drag strips. These systems weren't just reliable, they were actually making more power than carburetors ever could. Here's what killed the carburetors. It wasn't just that fuel injection worked better. It was that it eliminated every single problem that had driven people crazy about carburetors for decades. Cold starting problems? Gone. The computer knew exactly how much extra fuel to add for cold starts and automatically leaned out the mixture as the engine warmed up. Altitude changes? Irrelevant. The oxygen sensor told the computer exactly what the air-fuel mixture was, and it adjusted automatically. Tuning for different modifications? The system learned and adapted. Install a bigger cam, and the fuel injection would figure out the new requirements within a few hundred miles. By the early 90s, even the most hardcore carburetor guys were secretly considering fuel injection swaps. By the late 90s, carburetor manufacturers were desperately trying to stay relevant in a world that was moving past them. The aftermarket fought back with programmable fuel injection systems that gave tuners the control they were used to with carburetors. But it was too late. The war was over. Here's the final irony. Carburetors didn't lose because they were bad. They lost because they were too good at what they were designed to do. They were mechanical marvels that could precisely meter fuel and air using nothing but vacuum signals and mechanical linkages. But that same mechanical precision that made them beautiful also made them inflexible. A carburetor tuned for one condition would never be perfect for any other condition. Fuel injection could be perfect for every condition simultaneously. 4 carburetor legends. 4 completely different approaches to the same basic problem. How do you get the perfect mixture of fuel and air into an engine under every possible condition? Holley said, "Hit it hard and hit it now." The double pumper was pure aggression. No waiting, no hesitation, just raw fuel delivery that could wake up any engine. Edelbrock said, "Make it work for everyone." The Performer was the people's choice, reliable, forgiving, and capable enough to satisfy both daily drivers and weekend warriors. Rochester said, "Why choose between economy and power?" The Quadrajet was engineering genius that most people never understood. Small primaries for efficiency, massive secondaries for power, and a computer-like brain made of springs and diaphragms. Carter said, "Do it right the first time?" The AFB was the foundation that everything else was built on. Solid engineering that worked so well, other companies just copied it and put their names on it. But in the end, none of them won the war. Because while they were fighting each other, the real revolution was happening in computer labs and electronics companies. Electronic fuel injection didn't just beat carburetors, it made them irrelevant. Not because carburetors were bad, but because fuel injection was better at everything carburetors did, plus everything they couldn't do. Every cold morning start that actually worked. Every altitude change that didn't require retuning. Every modification that the system learned and adapted to automatically. Every perfect air-fuel ratio under every possible condition. That's what ended the carburetor wars. Not a better carburetor. A completely different way of thinking about fuel delivery. From the Holley that demanded respect to the Edelbrock that earned loyalty to the Rochester that confused everyone, to the Carter that started it all. These weren't just carburetors. They were the engineering marvels that fed muscle cars and taught us what precision really meant. But precision gave way to perfection. Mechanical genius gave way to electronic intelligence. And the carburetor wars ended not with victory, but with evolution. That's why carburetors will always be remembered not just as parts, but as the last purely mechanical fuel delivery systems that could turn gasoline and air into the soundtrack of American performance. They fed the legends. They created the tribal loyalties. They built the hot rod culture that still defines us today. And then they stepped aside so the future could happen. The carburetor wars are over. Electronic fuel injection won. But the lessons those little aluminum miracles taught us about precision, craftsmanship, and the pursuit of perfect combustion, those will never die.